And so the door has closed, and I believe it is our time to begin. Welcome, everybody, to the representation of queer identities in Terry Pratchett's Discworld. My name is Essi Virtanen, and I am extremely happy to see so many of you here. I'm pretty sure this is the most probably Discworld fans I've seen at the same place at the same time, with the acknowledgement that we are all here for this. And that's awesome. Welcome. We have a very limited time frame here, so unfortunately I'm going to have to ask you to leave the comments and questions until the end. If you do raise your hand, I will promptly ignore you. So, what this presentation is about. You might not be able to see the small print there, but that is the title page of my master's thesis, with the same title that I wrote and published in 2022 when I graduated from the University of Turku from the English language department. That's basically most of my credentials. I literally wrote the book on this. This is my main source for this whole thing. My other credentials do happen to be that I did a minor study in gender studies as well, with some focus on queer theory and so on. So that was also utilized for this thesis. Yeah, well, there's also the lived experience of being a queer woman myself, so there is a bit of own voices involved in here, but I did make sure to involve studies from, well, focusing on those parts of the community I myself am not a part of. I have no intention to be here and talk over, for example, the transgender people who might be reading these novels and seeing the representation there and so on, so I did my best to also involve studies with their voices involved. What this presentation is not about, it's not an introduction to the Discworld series. If you don't know anything about the books, if you haven't read any of them, this might not be the program for you, because I will be telling spoilers about various of the books. I analyzed 16 of the 41, and I had 64 pages of the thesis itself. That says that there's a lot of material to still go through, but yeah, you will be getting spoilers, so now is the final moment to leave in case you haven't read some of them. Yeah. This is also not an introduction to queer theory. I also don't have time for that and the meat of the matter. As said, there's 64 pages of the thesis, and I've had to cut out a few things from that as well, so I can give you this kind of Spark Notes version of the whole thing. I will be giving you a bit of keywords and terminology and some introduction to the articles and books that I used for the queer theory analysis, but not really an in-depth look. This is also not me putting words in Terry Pratchett's mouth. This is not me saying all of these characters are gay and that is the end-all be-all and you're wrong if you disagree with me. That's not the point here. This is an interpretation and an analysis, and yeah. We do have some actual canon queer representation in the novels, but this is also not about my personal headcanons. You are welcome to come talk to me about those after the presentation. I am a fangirl after all. I will gladly discuss those with you later, but yeah, I am not assigning any identities to anyone here. Let's get to the key word, some terminology that's somewhat important to at least know and also know what I mean when I use these terms. I'm using the term queer as an umbrella term for everything here, mainly because that's the term that in academia is used for this kind of analysis, and it's this sort of nondescript umbrella term that's all-inclusive. It basically is here meaning the same as LGBTQIA+, or in Finnish the rainbow community and so on, but in here we use that because, well, Pratchett himself doesn't really assign any kind of official terms for any of these characters either. This is interpretation. Then we have queer reading, which is a practice where you basically place this kind of queer lens on top of a text, and you look at it through the analysis and thought that if there was something queer here, or for example, if there is something thematic here that rings a bit queer, if something feels like it could be relatable, and so on. Then we have these terminology pairs. I hope that you're all aware what heterosexual and homosexual mean at this point, and cisgender and transgender and so on. Allosexual and alloromantic are basically the pairs to asexual and aromantic, the sort of normative versions, the equivalents of hetero and cis. So people who feel some kind of romantic or sexual attraction in comparison to asexual and aromantic people who feel very little, none at all, or under very specific circumstances, and so on. Then we have these three words: heteronormativity, cisnormativity, and amateur normativity. These are the sort of structures in place in society where heterosexuality, cisgenderness, and allosexualness and alloromanticism are sort of seen as the baseline, the normal human way of being, the default, the factory settings, and the normative structures of the world enforce these ideas and push the sort of version of things where these are the norm and everybody outside of that are abnormal. Then we have gender performativity. This is a concept that features surprisingly strongly in many Discworld books. It was coined by the theorist Judith Butler in their book Gender Trouble. That was one of the main sources, especially for the gender stuff in my analysis here. It's essentially the concept that for every single person out here, gender is a performance that we put on for other people, for this normative structure in society, that whether you are cis or trans, you do have to perform your gender at some level so other people know what you are performing. And there's expectations, there's norms. Everybody is expecting that women perform womanhood in a particular way, and if you don't, you're looked at weird. Where we get to otherness and othering. Otherness and othering are what happens when you're not meeting these norms, when people do treat you like a freak or a weird person for not meeting these norms. When you are outside of these norms, you might be othered, you are treated differently, you are pushed aside, you are made to feel that you are not included. But let's start from the very beginning, where I got my initial interest in queer analysis of Discworld. Let's not go to the very beginning, because then we would have to go to 6th grade when I picked up the Finnish copy of Soul Music, and that's too long of a story. But what it all began in university was from my bachelor's thesis, the title of which was The Character of Cheery Littlebottom as an Allegory for the Transgender Experience in Terry Pratchett's Discworld. And that was where it began, and I did use most of the material from that BA thesis for this version as well. So let's get into it. Before we get to Cheery, we need to talk about the dwarves. The dwarves of Discworld are a very fascinating bunch, and, well, I assume we all kind of know dwarves, those short, warrior-like, bearded dudes who mine and make jewelry and weapons, and then they drink ale and sing about the gold they have mined, and that's the basics of it. And mostly they originated from Tolkien, of course, who got the inspiration from the Icelandic sagas, but nobody really answered the question of, if every single dwarf is this short, bearded warrior dude, where do more dwarves come from? And that's where Pratchett came in and went with an interesting route of the dwarves living in a single-gender homonormative society where all the dwarves are men. Dwarves have one gender expression allowed, and that's man. All the dwarves are men. However, they do recognize that there are two sexes. The fact that there are two sexes is simply just the sole matter of the two dwarves trying to figure out if they can have babies together. Nobody else is getting involved with that. So they do recognize there are females around, but nobody talks about that because all the dwarves are men. And because of that, all dwarf relationships are basically homosexual because they're all between men, because that's the only option there is. Until we get to Cheery Littlebottom, who in the novel Feet of Clay becomes the first openly female and openly woman dwarf. I came to the conclusion that Cheery's journey of coming out, of transitioning, is kind of ringing similar to the transition experience of a transgender woman. And for this analysis, I mainly used a study by Heidi Levitt and Maria Ippolito, where they did this kind of questionnaire from a bunch of transgender people who who explained their identity development and these kinds of matters and answered a kind of interview. And then from those answers, they gathered these kind of collective statements and then cross-checked with these interviewees whether they seemed accurate in their identity development. And a lot of those statements were very similar to a lot of the things that Cheery goes through in her transition. In Feet of Clay, she started off very gradually. She starts wearing makeup, jewelry, wears a long skirt, puts high heels on her heavy, clunky dwarven boots, and so on, and doesn't really make much of a big deal about herself when she's doing it. That doesn't, however, mean that other people won't make a big deal out of it, because one of the things that mirrored these studies of Levitt and Ippolito was the how she was received at the end of all things, or at the beginning, actually. Some of the statements that she got at the workplace were, "That's disgusting. What if kids come in?" And this kind of immediate assumption of perversion and impropriety is unfortunately an aspect and a response that many transgender people have to face to this day when coming out. There's this assumption that there's something inappropriate and something private and something gross about expressing your gender as you are. Another version is how people discuss Cheery when she's not present. In more detailed, Captain Carrot here, who says to Sergeant Angyua, "He told you he was female," which, well, there's misgendering going on there, but we also can give Carrot some slack because dwarves only have had one pronoun until now, and he does correct himself and goes on to say, "I would have thought she'd have the decency to keep it to herself." But there we see it again. It's supposed to be private. It's supposed to be something that you don't talk about. As long as you don't shove it in my face. As many of us might have heard at some point, somewhere. But then we get to this word. This is something we come across in The Fifth Elephant. This is a word that gets thrown at Cheery when her and multiple of the City Watch, multiple of her colleagues, head to the ancestral home of dwarves, Uberwald, and she faces off with these conservative dwarves, these traditional people who do not believe that there's such a thing as a woman dwarf. And this word gets thrown at her when she comes over in her dress and makeup and jewelry, and the response that her colleagues give tells very clearly what this word is. Detroitus the Troll is convinced that this is a word you do not use to refer to anybody. It's cruel and it's mean, and he threatens violence immediately, as we all should when slurs are thrown at the faces of our transgender friends. So yeah, there's a slur for dwarf women, and that says a lot. So dwarf women are transgender, at least somewhat, at least in the beginning of things, because they do go through this kind of journey, this transition, this gender revolution that started by Cheery. But cultural context matters, even in fantasy. This might not feel, in so many words, transgender because they're women who are just being women. It's more of a feminist thing, isn't it? But really, a human woman expressing womanhood and acting like a woman is not really faced with the same kind of vitriol that dwarf women go through in the start of it. It's not significant, but a dwarf woman saying that she's a woman is significant. And they need to come out. Everybody makes the baseline assumption. It's normative in dwarf society that every dwarf is a man. So if you have to come out, you're not really anything but trans. But there's this interesting aspect relating to cultural context, that the dwarves that do come out as women still present features that are traditionally read as masculine. They continue to grow beards, they wear armor and so on. But for them, it's not a feature of maleness, it's a feature of dwarfness. It's a part of their culture. And they kind of create this own way of being a woman, a dwarf woman. But they continue to have to campaign against this equality and against this pushback that they're getting from the more conservative part of their society. By the end of the series, it's going pretty well because the Low King of Dwarves has come out as the Low Queen, and things are going quite well, but at the beginning, it feels very trans in that way. And the main point here is that if we can love and respect Cheery as a self-declared woman, then why would we discriminate anybody in the real world who does the same? If we come across somebody who comes to us and says that I'm a woman, I use she, her pronouns, and maybe has a beard, so what? If Cheery can do it, why can't we? And that's one of the things that I did go through in the thesis itself. In literary analysis, there might be some people who read it who are not aware that it's a good thing to have queer representation, that there's positive consequences to that, so I did have to use some of the material to proving this point, but I have the feeling that I won't have to prove that to you all, so I have left it out from this presentation. Now let's get to the witches. That might not feel kind of intuitively queer initially, but the main thing that these books really shine a light to is the binary nature of magic in Discworld. In there, the main point is that witches are women and wizards are men. And that might feel quite cisnormative to begin with, but we have to remember that Discworld is satire, it's parody. It's meant to shine a light on these silly normative structures, and while they might be present in this world, they're the punchline. And the main idea is to subvert these ideas and not enforce them. I had 3 different chapters on the witches, where one of them concerned the womanhood of witches and how that gender expression of womanhood while being a witch is also kind of queer, but I have had to leave that out for time's sake. So let's initially go to the binary of witch and wizard, or the subtitle, Escarina Smith, the gendered nature of magic, and choosing the secret third option. Because in Equal Rights, she does exactly that. Escarina Smith is a girl who gets given the powers of a wizard. And in this novel, the main kind of through-all is that the vague concept of these gendered practices and norms have become the law, or the lore, that's the pun. And the law says that a woman being a wizard is against the law. You can't do that, that's not allowed. But Esk chooses to do it anyway. This is one of the best citation quotes from the novel itself. She'd be both, or none at all. And if we place that queer lens on top of this statement, and if you read witch as woman and wizard as man, this is very non-binary of a thing to say. Don't you agree? And Esk does it. By the end of the novel, she gets a blue pointy hat with stars on it, and wizards traditionally wear robes with stars and moons and such, and witches always have their black hat, the big black pointy hat, so everybody knows they're a witch. And Esk gets both, but at the same time kind of neither. Her own thing. And the way that I conclude this chapter is that, does Esk become the first female wizard, or does she become the first non-binary mage? Who's to say? Then let's go to Granny, the maiden crone, with the subtitle of Granny Weatherwax, literally running away from the romance subplot. That she does. We see it in one of the books. And yeah, I'm well aware that in Equal Rights she kind of had some kind of a thing going on with the Arch-Chancellor of that novel, but Pratchett himself has kind of said that the Granny in Equal Rights is kind of a proto-Granny, and the character gets developed more in the in the following novels, where she kind of feels fairly asexual or aromantic in many regards. Once again, this is not me assigning an identity, this is me analyzing the text and seeing that there are some things in the text that could ring relatable for asexual or aromantic readers. Granny really resists amateur normative expectations hard enough that it's an entire plot point in Lords and Ladies. She encounters an old suitor of Mustrum Ridkley, and all of the narrativium is gathering around this whole thing and putting up these tropes that there should be this rekindling of this old coulda, woulda maybe shoulda romance, and Granny is way too busy solving the actual problem and fighting the antagonist to go along with any of these expectations. Nanny even says at some point that if there hadn't been a suitor around when she was younger, it would have never crossed her mind in the first place. There's quotes in the novels where Granny says that she has no romance in her heart and things like this that feel quite ace in a way. In one of the novels, Granny does see multiple versions of herself in different trouser legs of time, where there's versions that did get married, that did have children, that have very different futures. And in many works of fiction, this could be this kind of, oh no, I did wrong, and what I could have had, and things like that. But Granny never comes to these conclusions. She's kind of vaguely happy for these different versions of herself, but she's not jealous of them in any way. And she's fiercely proud of her success and the life she has led. She has no regrets of growing old without romance or sexual intimacy, and we do get a confirmation in Lords and Ladies that she has had no sexual intimacy because the unicorn obeys her, and unicorns only go along with people who are pure, and so on. So that's one of the rare kind of confirmations of something like this, because Pratchett very, very rarely really goes into any detail with any matters like this. So that's fascinating. Now, let's get gendered, because Monstrous Regiment is, in my opinion, possibly the queerest Discworld novel you can get. I read this novel and, well, I had to dedicate an entire chapter to only this novel, whereas I read multiple for the dwarves and multiple for the witches. And I annotated my copy. I put in a little note for every single instance where something relating to Judith Butler's theory of gender performativity came up. And I have that copy with me here. Look at this thing. It's a fan. I do have blue notes there for another queer thing going on in here that you might guess, but that's for the next slide, or the slide after that. But yeah, this is... You can fit so much gender in this bad boy. And the bad boy being Polly Perks, who is the main character of this novel. Polly Perks is the person we see the country of Borogravia through, and who experiences this kind of journey of discovering many things and many people along the way. And Polly Perks is what I would call a self-taught scholar of the gender performance, because she has spent a long, long time in her family's inn analyzing all of the men, all of the young soldiers who come through. She learns how to talk, how to walk, how much to fart and burp, how to never hug anybody, and how to punch your friends. And she learns how to be a man. There's also the aspect of thinking with your socks. You put socks down the front of your pants, you walk with your socks ahead of you, you think with your socks, you let your socks do the talking and thinking, and that gets repeated a lot in the novel. And the socks become this kind of analogy for masculinity, and we all know what. And in the end, the main conclusion that I can draw from all of these notes is that masculinity and femininity are just exaggerated jokes. We're all doing a drag act. Gender can be performed by anybody if you know how to do it. If you study it, you can just go along with it. Gender is made up. But I'm once again not assigning any identities, but this guy could be trans though. Because Sergeant Jackram is, in the end, revealed to be female. I said there would be spoilers. But when you reread the novel, it gives kind of different kinds of colors to many of the things that he says. One of the main slogans of Sergeant Jackram is, "Upon my oath, I'm not a violent / dishonest man, but," and then he proceeds to lie or be violent or shout and so on. And that could be read as him making use of the fact that he's not really a man to tell these lies that technically aren't lies. But There's only one single instance in the entire novel where Jackram is referred to with the feminine pronoun her. And even after that, the narrator corrects itself. Jackram had turned her chair to the fire and had settled back. Around him, the kitchen worked. Even the narrator knows that this was an instance of misgendering. Let's go back. And Polly continues to refer to Jackram as a man. The novel continues to refer to him as a man. And yeah, Jackram lives the rest of his days as a man, happy and comfortable. There would have been the option for all of the women in the military to come out and to continue living as women, but a few of them, Jackram included, chose not to, who chose to stay, to keep their secret and to continue to live as men. And they're allowed and they're happy and comfortable, and that's wonderful. Now let's get to lesbians. Even though it's not a term that Pratchett uses, but we have Tonka and Lofty, who are few of the rare canonically confirmed queer characters in Discworld. They're the blue tabs in this mess of things. Because at some point in the novel, Polly discovers that Lofty is a woman. And this moment and many moments afterwards kind of reveal Polly's and her culture's, and maybe the reader's, heteronormative biases, because Polly immediately comes to the assumption that, oh, right, Lofty's a girl, that makes sense. She followed her boyfriend to the front, right, perfect sense. And then when she discovers that Tonka is also a girl, then she has this kind of glitch of, wait, because she's well aware that the way these two are behaving with each other is not strictly platonic. There's something clearly going on in there, and she has to face the internal bias that I made this assumption thinking they were both, well, that they were not both women, and now that I know they both are, I can still see these clear indications of romance, and now I have to face the fact that they are women and they are in love. And other people have to face it too, because this is how Polly speaks to somebody who discovers also by the end of the novel that they are women. Oh yes, sir. Both of them, sir. Don't go there, sir. Because it's so obvious to everybody around that Tonka and Lofty have something special. Polly sees it very clearly in this section. They were holding hands. They always held hands when they thought they were alone. But it seemed to Polly that they didn't hold hands like people who were, well, friends. And Pratchett very rarely goes into any detail about any romance he writes, heterosexual or otherwise. It's very much this same attitude as dwarves have towards the sexes of their fellow dwarves. It's none of our business, just let them do it. It happens, but let's not get too deep into it. But this is fairly explicit for a Pratchett romance thing. And there's so much more. Honestly, like I said, I read 16 of the 41 novels and I still ran out of time and space. I had 64 pages, and by the end, from those 16 books, I had a final chapter titled basically everything else that I wasn't able to fit under the headings that came before. And even from those parts, I had to divide into two. I had two chapters, one of which concerned the characters in Ankh-Morpork, where I go into more detail about the one confirmed gay wizard we have, about what the hell is up with Nobby and all the cross-dressing and so on. But I figured I'd introduce the undead as the chapter that I talk about, because we see there, Glad to be Grey, the undead community as an allegory for the queer. Glad to be Grey is the slogan of the Fresh Start Club started by the zombie Reg Shue, and well, it's very directly grabbed from the gay pride groups of the 80s. Glad to be gay was a very popular slogan. The undead and the gothic have very much walked hand in hand with queerness in literary analysis for as long as we've done it. The monstrousness and otherness of these creatures in Gothic literature has rung very queer throughout the ages, both as a way of queer people to write about their own experiences of being othered and being seen as monstrous, but as well as the normative side of society going, I'm not going to say gay people are evil, but look at this gay-coded character acting all evil, and so on. But yeah, undead in Discworld almost feels to me as kind of a placeholder for queer. Queer and undead both are these kind of umbrella terms that cover many kind of fringe identities who are discriminated against and different from each other, but can also all come together under the same umbrella. I mean, werewolves are considered undead in Discworld, while they're not really undead the same way vampires and zombies and Igors are, for example. But they're still considered that. I write about Angua in this chapter and how werewolfness feels kind of bisexual in many ways. But the queer people, well, the undead people of Ankh-Morpork, they have a club, they have a bar. We have gay bars. They have beers. And the way this bar is described, for the vampires, it was a place to hang up. For the werewolves, it was where you let your hair down. For the boogeyman, it was a place to come out of the closet. It's barely even a simile. It's very on the nose if we combine it with the Glad to be Grey slogan. Terry isn't playing around here. And vampires especially tend to ring quite queer in literature. For example, Carmilla, lesbian vampire novel. And they do in Discworld as well. In this chapter, I write about 3 different vampires in Discworld and how their journeys, how their different ways of being all have a little bit of something queer going on in there. For example, a few of these tabs here are about Maledict, the vampire in this regiment, who, to be really honest, I myself am not quite sure what their gender identity is by the end of everything. I chose to refer to them with the pronoun they in here because while at the end Maledict confirms that they are Maledicta, but she, well, seems very uncomfortable with this fact. There's multiple scenes, or at least a couple, where everybody else has already been revealed. But, for example, somebody addressing the whole regiment goes, "Well, ladies, and, sir," at Maledict, and Maledict doesn't correct him at all. They're like, mm-hmm. And Jackram, at some point, says that he was certain about everybody except for the vampire, because who the hell knows with vampires? So vampires tend to have this kind of androgynity to them that Maledict has, very much so. And by the end, when the women of Borogravia have already been given their own kind of feminine, slightly more freely military garb, and Polly and Mal meet each other later on to go back to the front, it's never really specified which version of this uniform Maledict is wearing. Who's to say? Then there's the interesting thing about Otto Shriek, the vampire photographer. I didn't really get as much of a queer vibe specifically, but the way he is presenting himself, his own vampirism, to me felt a bit queer in a queer reading, because the way Otto is behaving is very stereotypical. He puts on this opera cloak and a waistcoat with frog tails, and has the stereotypical Bela Lugosi kind of widow's peak haircut slicked back, and speaks with the traditional Uberwaldian accent of "I want to suck your blood." Because if people are laughing at you, they're not afraid of you. And that, in a couple of studies, has been shown to be something that queer people do as well. Because if you play into stereotypes, if you play into what people kind of know already, a very good example of this is the kind of effeminate gay man, the kind of gay best friend trope of those old romantic comedies of the 90s, where you have that one gay character who talks with a lisp and has the limp wrist and great hair and great clothes and is the support for the main character lady. If you behave like that, people know what you're about. They can laugh at you, they're not scared of you because they know what you're about. They don't need to give any more nuance to thinking about you. You're not a threat. And it kind of feels like that might be something that Otto is doing with vampirism. This is more of the queer reading thing where you put the lens on and see if there's something that feels thematically something, even though it's not really overt in the text. Then there's, of course, Sally, Salacia von Humperdinck, who joins the City Watch in the novel Thud, who is a vampire lady who is described as looking like a young boy, or at least a girl who wouldn't be bothered to be mistaken as such. That alone is kind of gender, and she does very openly flirt with Angua throughout the novel. There's the part where they both drop into the Ankh-Morpork sewers and are covered in mud, and Sally, being a vampire who can transform into bats, but because she's a female vampire, when she turns back she has no clothes on, and then she's here in the mud with Angua and goes, "We just need a paying audience." The flirting is very overt, and from Sally I get into Angua and her kind of thinking of Sally a lot and obsessing over her in this kind of stupid sexy Flanders way throughout the novel. And well, there's talk about compulsory heterosexuality and that kind of stuff. But yeah, the conclusions of the thesis, I mainly just picked up the SparkNotes versions or the editions from the whole thing, and I'm just going to read them out to you. While I have only been able to bring in analysis and quotes from the 16 of the 41 Discworld novels, it is evident from only this selection that the Discworld features queer themes within it. Pratchett displays queer themes in a positive light and uses means of parody and satire to normalize the non-normative rather than joke at the expense of it. Many stories display the performative nature of gender. The law is dictated by culture and norms, and laws can be broken and changed if they make no sense. I hope to have cracked open the door of looking at Discworld through a queer theoretical lens and shown that through the means of parody and humour, one can truly work to normalize queer identities and bring to question the restricting norms of society, as long as one knows where to direct the punchline. Here's my source. If you want to, if you want to actually see in more detail what the material was that I used for my thesis, you can just find it by Googling the title. There's all of it in there, and I do actually recommend you go skim through it, because yeah, I was terrified of rereading my own text for the sake of arranging this program, but it was fine. It wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We might actually have time for a few questions and comments and discussion. There's also my requirement for using this template. I loaded it from SlidesGo for free, and the only requirement was that I show this thank you slide at the end. So here it is. Thank you, SlidesGo, for sponsoring this presentation. That was it. Thank you. Does anybody have any? Yeah, you do. You?
Yeah, about Sergeant Jackrum.
Yes.
I saw this on Tumblr a while ago, and I thought it was really interesting that in the United States edition,
Yes.
That correction of the pronoun, finally calling him,
Yep.
is actually not there, and it refers to him as her at the end.
Yeah, the Americans fucked that up.
Yeah, my personal theory is that they thought it was a mistake and corrected it.
Probably.
I don't know if maybe it could be ideological, who knows.
It could be because all of the editions that have been published in the UK and everywhere else since do have Jackrum being referred to as her only ones and them correcting itself. So Americans might have fumbled it on that one. Yes?
About the dwarves.
Yes.
From the beginning. Isn't it kind of also representative of non-binariness? Because like the only option is being a man.
Yeah.
Even though there are two sexes, but, you know, there is only one gender.
Yeah.
The thing.
Yeah, it does kind of also feel non-binary in the weird way of making a binary where there was no binary before. And
Making your own.
yeah, exactly. Making it for yourself. Yeah. I had a thought, but it went away. Yes, there's an aspect of it that I also write about, that even though we know as readers as a fact that Cheery is biologically female, because Sergeant Angua's werewolf senses can differentiate between sexes somehow, there's the thing that that's not a requirement for all the dwarves that come out as women. We don't know if all of the dwarves that come out as women are biologically female, and that doesn't really matter. That's not something that the dwarves are worried about.
I mean, they in general just don't care.
Yeah. Yes.
I wonder if you come across something poly in there.
Polyamorous, you mean? Not that I can recall, but I'm not at all saying that there wouldn't be a possibility for that. Yes?
With the witches, did you look at Tiffany Aching as well?
Yeah, Tiffany's novels were some that I had to actually leave out, because in Shepherd's Crown we do get the first male witch, for example. But yeah, I had to make the decision that I'm not going to analyze Tiffany, that I only focus on the adult. Yes.
So, what's your thoughts about the golems?
I do write about golems in that last chapter that I left out for time, that I now apparently could have included. But yeah, I write about Gladys in those in the Moist von Lippik novels, because the golems are genderless beings, but some of them choose to state that I am actually a woman and wear dresses and present themselves. And in there again, we see that in Discworld, it's nobody's business what you do with your gender. Just don't bother anybody. Pratchett really gives this kind of, just don't be an asshole towards people. Let them live. And yeah, the golems definitely have something like that going on. You can read about that in the thesis. Yes?
Yeah, I'd like to add to your reading of the dwarven women as trans, because in my very unbiased opinion as a trans man, it is the only correct reading.
Thank you.
If we take the definition of transness as identifying as something other than your gender assigned as birth,
Exactly.
and all the dwarves are men, so they're all assigned male or men at birth.
Exactly.
Then anyone who identifies anything other than a man is, by definition, trans.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree. Yes?
Yeah. So I just read the truth. So the Otto is very much on my mind. And,
He's my favorite.
yeah, I did like it a lot, and I was wondering, this is more like more building up on the idea that it's like performance of the evil vampire. Yeah. I think it might be also when at the beginning of the book, Otto almost always turns into dust when they take pictures, but then immediately is like, well, I've got this solution for this, so it might be just like a comedic performance, so there's no harm. So everyone can just see like this is just a vampire who turns to dust sometimes. So that might also be a performance.
Yeah, playing into the comedic aspect, seeming unthreatening, because there's a comment in the back.
You described the kind of traditional male signifiers in the woven society as like always maybe cultural. So I was wondering that in comparison, these female representations with the woven female characters, you read them as, are they influence of an outside culture coming into the woven culture, or is it still something that comes from within, specifically how the expression goes, the high heels and makeup that you described?
I feel like it's kind of both, because in the end, the only way that Cheery would know that being a woman is an option is when she moves to Ankh-Morpork and sees human women. So in that sense, being a woman is this kind of cultural exchange of seeing human women and taking inspiration from that. But as things go on, for example, in Unseen Academicals, we have this one female dwarf. I'm forgetting her name, but she's a clothing designer.
Madame.
Yes, yeah. And she is very clearly a dwarf woman, but has this luscious beard and a lot of jewelry, a lot of bedazzled armor, and voice that was like melted dark chocolate that was perhaps also smoked, and these kind of descriptions. And it kind of seems like at the start there's this cultural exchange, but then as things progress and more dwarf women start to come out, they begin to build their own version of womanhood with this kind of dwarven cultural aspects, but also femininity thrown in. Yes?
I think it's also interesting in the unseen academicals. One of the main characters is selling female trolls makeup and clothing and stuff that is like, because they come to the city and they see the female humans and then they kind of copy, but then she comes up with the idea that you should not make dresses that make the troll females look like fat humans, you should make dresses that make the troll females look like big, strong women. And also like, if you like, it's a really interesting, I think, like fun aspect of like the city is making the like, well, trolls didn't have that much like different clothing or anything for the females, and males apparently in the books when they are not in the city, but they come into the city, they see that okay, other females have nice things, and then it's like, let's have nice things as well, and it's like performance. They like, clearly the city makes them feel that they can or want to like be more, like showing more than they did in their like previous home place.
Yes, agreed. But now I think we're running out of time. I'm going to say thank you again, and do feel free to come chat with me afterwards because I love meeting fellow fans. Thank you.